Good evening. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this Earth Day celebration in collaboration between Brock University's Environmental Sustainability Research Center and Niagara Parks. My name is Heather Gorman. I'm the Manager of Education and Public Programming with Niagara Parks. And I'm joined here tonight by Ryan Plummer, Professor and Director of the Environmental Sustainability Research Center, and Amanda Smits, the ESRC Administrator. Before we start tonight's talk, we would just like to take a second to acknowledge that the land on which both Brock University and the Niagara Parks were built is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging this reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous people. So prior to our keynote speaker taking our virtual stage tonight, we will be first joined by a group of Brock University students presenting on decolonization and cultural safety as learned by undergraduate students. This presentation is a collaborative work of Kian, Rego, Ryanne, Logan, Kahlan, Woodhouse, Tory, Shklanka, and Kiara, Kalenuik. And our keynote speaker this evening is Dr. Robyn Bourgeois. Dr. Bourgeois is a mixed-race Cree woman whose Cree family comes from communities in the Treaty 8 territory of the Lesser Slave Lake region. She is also connected through marriage and her 3 children to the 6 nations of the Grand River. Dr. Bourgeois is an associate professor in the Center for Women's and Gender Study at Brock University and is currently serving as the university's acting provost, Indigenous Engagement. Directly following the presentation this evening, Ryan Plummer will be conducting a short Q&A with Dr. Bourgeois. And if at any point during the presentation you have a question, please feel free to type it in the question section of the LifeSize app. Thank you again all so much for joining us this evening. And without further ado, I'm excited to turn over the reins to our Brock University students. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather, for such a kind introduction. And hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting us tonight. I'm just going to start by sharing my screen here. Cross our fingers that it works. Okay. And then if someone can just confirm that you guys can all see that.
It looks great, Kian.
Wonderful. So again, thank you all for inviting us tonight. We're all super excited to be sharing with you just a little bit about what we've been working on together as a group on decolonization and cultural safety. So my name is Kian, and I'd just like to begin by introducing you all to the rest of our team. So we're a group of undergraduate students from both Indigenous and non-Indigenous backgrounds, and we're in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th year, mostly from the Faculty of Applied Health Sciences. And we've been working with Dr. Valerie Michelson, who's an Associate Professor from the Faculty of Applied Health Sciences here at Brock, along with Sandy Howe from Experiential Education, and Sandra Wong and Cindy Biancanello from Aboriginal Student Services. So originally, we began our learning journey together back in September as a directed reading, and we were focused on learning about reconciliation and decolonization as they relate to Indigenous health. So as a group, we came up with the 2 following learning objectives. The first one was the focus for Kahlan and myself, being the 2 non-Indigenous students on our team. We wanted to learn as much as we could about how we could be effective allies in our fields one day and to promote cultural safety in our communities. The second learning objective that we came up with was the focus for our self-identified students who are going to be fantastic change makers one day. But they were focused on answering the question of how can I, as an Indigenous student, learn more about my cultural history and be a champion for my community through improving health. So over the course of the year, we decided to document our learning through keeping a weekly reflective portfolio, which helped us to really engage meaningfully with our course content and the guest speakers that we were fortunate enough to have. And what we began to realize was not only were we growing deeper on our personal journey, but we were growing together as a group. And we were fortunate enough to have created such a culturally safe learning environment that we were all comfortable sharing our experiences and perspectives with each other, which really helped to shape and define our own personal learning. So as such a diverse group, we really wanted to take advantage of our unique experiences and ask the question of what are these key foundations that we were able to create in our group, and what can we take away from that to overall translate that to creating safe pedagogical spaces for other Indigenous and non-Indigenous students to come together from various different backgrounds and fields and departments and learn together. So before answering all those questions and to really unpack that, the first thing we had to do was to identify what our positionality was personally, and to ask the question of what does that mean with relationship to our learning? So I'll pass it now to Kahlan to further unpack positionality for you.
Thank you, Kian. My name is Kahlan. I'm the other non-Indigenous student who was fortunate enough to be a part of this course. And so I'm just going to explain a little bit about positionality. So on the slide here, we have 3 individuals who come from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, and who have different life experiences in general. And so we need to understand how their backgrounds play a part in how they might perceive Indigenous health and how they might approach decolonization. So they all have, as I mentioned, different life experiences, upbringings, ethnic and cultural backgrounds that have directly impacted their health in some way or another, as well as the opportunities that they have been presented with throughout their lives. So for this, as well as their own context, what's important to understand is that while these individuals have all faced challenges, how they view it, decolonization and reconciliation will be different. And that was true for us as well. So this was really the starting point for us coming together as a group that really a lot of us have never met in person because of COVID. So we needed to understand our own positionalities and how these were unique to each individual in our group. So along the way, we were also able to learn how to support one another in each other's learning journeys, which was really special. So what we noticed, especially with our group, was that everyone felt very supported and they all felt that they had a voice and were able to kind of be comfortable in the group environment, which is something that's really rare in undergraduate learning, especially in kind of STEM where people are a little bit competitive, and it was just really special to have a group like that. So our small learning environment was essential in creating this safe and brave space where we could really experience true, deep, and transformational learning. We were able to achieve our own unique learning goals by sharing our changes in positionality along our learning journey throughout the 8 months. And by listening to each other's different perspectives and positions, we were able to help each other learn as well. I'm going to pass to Ryan now, who's going to talk about another key component of our learning.
Thank you, Kahlan. So my name's Ryan, and I'm a First Nations student in this course. Another aspect that heavily influenced our learning as a group was something that we referred to as the 4 R's. The 4 R's that we shaped our course around this year were respect, responsibility, reciprocity, and relationship. The meaning of these R's comes from respect, meaning having compassion for others and ourselves throughout our journey. Responsibility, taking ownership for our actions. Reciprocity, giving back to others what they give to you or showing gratitude always. And relationship, having consideration for others and showing the importance of building and maintaining these relationships while honoring them over time. These are the foundation of our learning. Our main takeaway from this experience is that you cannot have one of these components without the others. Our group focused especially on the relationship aspect by inviting Indigenous elders along with other influential speakers to join our meetings. A personal experience that I had with an Indigenous elder was having the opportunity to invite an elder from my own First Nation and to learn about teaching specific to my culture as a Lenape woman. This experience helped me with my confidence as well as with growing spiritually and creating more passion for wanting to learn more about my culture. To track our learning and growth throughout this journey, we wrote reflective journals that focused on topics covered in each week as they related to the goals of our learning. Something that we hope to do in the coming months together is to use the learning from our journals and discussions to write a research paper sharing the value of small group environments in academic settings, especially as it pertains to Indigenous health and decolonization, as well as creating safe pedagogical spaces in university. Each member of our group felt very comfortable, and we were comfortable enough to share our opinions and responses to sometimes very sensitive topics and respond, which strengthened our bond as a group and helped us to continue our growth and learning journey. I'll now introduce you to Tory to share some of her experiences with you.
Hi everyone, my name is Tory Shklanka. I am from the Ninutikuva Inuit Nation from Northern Labrador. I actually grew up in Alberta, and that's why I really was so fortunate to join this course, because I got to learn so much about my culture, as I didn't get to do that growing up in Calgary. So I want to talk about my experience with this group and how the building of relationships impacted my spiritual, educational, and personal growth. So as Ryan mentioned earlier, we got to meet with elders. We got to choose an elder that we wanted to meet with and interview, and I chose to meet with Mr. David Ford, who lives in Baker Lake in Nunavut. We actually video chatted for like 4 hours, and he showed me around Baker Lake on video chat. He really made me feel welcome and showed me about the extraordinary way that the Inuit live their life. It was really grounding and really life-changing for me, because I did grow up in a place where Indigenous culture was shunned, and I had no connection to my culture, my people whatsoever. So through learning about my culture and connecting with not only my elder, but we also got to listen to all of the other students' elders speak. It really taught us the importance of listening to what people have to say, especially these people, these Indigenous people, since a lot of us don't have the opportunities to be able to listen to elders speak. From the elders, we learned about traditional medicines, caring and respecting for our peers, life advice, and the importance of gratitude and giving thanks in every aspect of our life. There's so much we can learn from connecting back to our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit groups. And I hope one day you can all get the chance to learn from these people like we got to. It's really been a life-changing experience. I wish we had more time to go into it more, but yeah, it's really been great being able to connect back to the community. So now I'll pass on to Kahlan.
Thank you so much, Tory. That wraps our presentation. We want to thank everyone who's here right now for listening. And we've also included some resources that we found really helpful and really inspiring that we used along the way during our course. So we want to also give a special shout out to Dr. Michelson, Sandy, Sandra, and Cindy for being our other team members and for creating such a wonderful environment for us and such a great experience in university. And we also want to thank Dr. Bourgeois for inviting us to present today, and everyone who had a part in putting this on. So thank you.
I will stop sharing my screen. Give me 1 second. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all so much.
Just a quick thank you to Colin, Kian, Ryan, and Tory. Thank you so much for sharing. And I would like to turn it over to Dr. Bourgeois.
Tansi, Kiranas Kamatanao Au. Thank you all so much for being here today. Before I start, I also want to thank the organizers, Heather, Amanda, Brian. Thank you so much for thinking I was worthy of this platform today. I really value that. And thank you so much to all of the students who are here. I've been so inspired by you this semester, and when they asked for students to be involved, my first thought was your group. So thank you all for being here today and sharing your insights with the group. So before I begin the talk that I have planned for tonight, I need to open this session in a good way that really reflects Indigenous ways of knowing and doing. And this will be a surprise to some of you who have only maybe ever heard me speak, but I'm also a hand drummer and singer. And one of the ways I have been taught to start things in a good way is with a song. So I was very fortunate prior to coming to Brock to have been a guest in the Mi'kma'ki, a place you likely know as Nova Scotia, for several years before I came here. And I want to honor that relationship, but also honor all of you by performing their welcoming song as a way of welcoming you here tonight. So just so you know, this is 4 rounds. So you're going to hear 4 of the same rounds, but this is a welcoming song from Mi'kmaq territory. Thank you all so much for indulging me in starting this in a good way. Canada has a problem with violence against Indigenous women and girls. Compared to their non-Indigenous counterparts, Indigenous women and girls are disproportionately impacted by all forms of gender-based violence. For example, data from Canada's 2014 General Social Survey suggests that Indigenous women and girls are 3 times more likely than their non-Indigenous counterparts to experience or to report sexual violence. In fact, studies suggest that 75% of our women and girls will experience violence before the age of 18. And I should say, not just one form, but more likely multiple forms. And 51% will experience this violence before the age of 14. Similarly, Indigenous women and girls are 3 times more likely to experience violence in intimate relationships, with the 2014 General Social Survey noting that this violence was more likely to result in serious injury and or fear for one's life as compared to non-Indigenous women. Studies also suggest that upwards of 80% of Indigenous women and girls experience violence, family violence in their homes, and that they are aggressive. And in addition to that, Indigenous women and girls are aggressively targeted for sexual exploitation and human trafficking. Moreover, as the recent national inquiry confirmed, Indigenous women and girls experienced heightened risks of going missing and or being murdered. In fact, the rate is about 5.5 times that of non-Indigenous women. That's the homicide rate. In addition to this interpersonal violence, Indigenous women and girls are subject to multiple forms of gender-based structural violence that results in social, political, and economic marginalization, which in turn enables the interpersonal violence. Well, this is not readily apparent to many, in fact, when I say this. This pandemic of violence against Indigenous women and girls in Canada is an environmental issue. The dehumanization, abuse, and elimination of Indigenous women and girls is fundamentally tied to the colonial theft and illegal occupation of Indigenous lands, which in turn is tied to the environmental exploitation and destruction that underpins the current global climate crisis. In other words, meaningfully addressing violence against Indigenous women and girls, I argue, not only carries the potential of addressing all forms of gender-based violence, but also offers a legitimate and effective forward pathway of resilience, in response to the genocidal global climate change we're facing. Now, to make my case, I need to begin with Indigenous understandings of the innate connection between land, body, and sovereignty. While these teachings are common to many Indigenous groups, in my case, I'm going to ground them in my Nahia or Cree ways of knowing and doing. For me, when I think about this topic, it's the Cree concept of Lakotawin that perfectly captures the connection between land and body. In simple English terms, Lakotawin refers to the idea of all things being related. You've often heard this if you've heard Indigenous people say, all my relations. In Cree, that sounds like Kaki Ani Wakamakanak. That is that honor of that Lakotawin. According to our teachings, all things in creation, animate and inanimate, are lit into being as a result of a spark from a sacred soul fire. Now, given that common genesis, all things in creation are related and indeed interrelated in relationships of mutual respect and reciprocity. Moreover, given our common spark of existence, all things in creation are valued equally. There is no hierarchy because all life is valued and indeed needed to achieve that sacred balance of existence. Lakotawin positions Cree people not as owners of the land in the colonial or capitalist sense, but instead as relatives living in relationship with land. But that relationship is actually much more than this. A brilliant colleague of mine I was in discussion with, he recently reminded me, Indigenous people are the land. And not just because of that common, that extension of that common creation, but because it's the land which sustains us and which we thrive and we exist from. We are the land. We're also taught that we are borrowing the land from our children. And indeed, this is important, all children. And we have a responsibility to act ethically to protect the land. And I will talk a little bit more about this later. Thus, to live as good relatives in relationship to the land, Cree people live according to what we refer to as natural law. And that's a set of socio-legal principles and kind of guidelines that guide this relationship and lead us to living in what we refer to as Mino Pimatsawin, which is the good life, which is lived in harmony and balance with all of creation, in fact. These laws also ensure that we live in a way that minimizes the harm or any potential harms to all things in creation to ensure Minapamatsawin for future generations. Now, when I think about how to really show what natural law looks like to particularly people who may not be familiar with Cree law, the hunting of animals actually offers to me one of the best examples of how natural law is applied to the human relationship to land and creation. So while the killing of animals was, and for many of us continues to be necessary for our survival, it also actually constitutes a violation of natural law, because it results in ending the life of one of our ancestors. For this reason, because of this violation, there are really strict protocols around harvesting animals for food that not only respects and honors their sacrifice for us, but also pursues ecological responsibility. So there's a whole series of these, but I'll give you a few of the basic ones. We never take more than we need. We're killing an ancestor, and that's only about survival. That is never to be about greed or about sport. In fact, the taking of an animal's life for fun is absolutely abhorrent under Cree natural law. This is only ever about survival. We never overharvest. The idea of eliminating an entire species through hunting stands in direct opposition to everything that Cree natural law lays out. We honor that sacrifice by using and not wasting any part of that animal. You can see that from, the food, what we do with the food, but also you can see how we turn hides into drums, or we use sinew from them, we use bone, we use every little piece to honor that sacrifice. We do not waste any piece of that animal. We honor the sacrifice of an animal through ceremony. In fact, I was thinking about this as I was coming in or preparing for tonight, and even doing something as simple as picking medicines or picking, plants. We lay down tobacco, we say a prayer, we thank that ancestor for sacrificing, making that sacrifice for our survival, and we honor that. And again, don't overpick all of those things. Those same rules apply. We do not kill pregnant animals. We do not kill young animals. There are very strict protocols around that. And we also commit that if we are going to take an ancestor's life, that should not be done through suffering. There should be no suffering involved, and there should be a clean kill. And if that animal suffers, you make immediate amends through ceremony, through offerings, but you do not let that animal suffer. That's so key to all of this. In this way, Cree ways of knowing and doing are fundamentally grounded in ecological responsibility and respect for the land and the natural world. Now, another consequence of this creational relationality is that we understand the health and well-being of our people as being fundamentally connected to the health and the well-being of the land. Now, I know I'm likely proverbially preaching to the choir tonight when I say this, but we understand that an unhealthy earth cannot sustain us as healthy people. For this reason, we live thoughtfully and carefully in accordance with natural law so as not to harm the natural world that sustains us. Now, with these understandings in place, I can now make the case that the violence Indigenous women and girls experience is an environmental issue. And this necessarily involves a focal pivot at this point to discussing colonialism in Canada. Now, to ensure that we are on the same page, I want to start by explaining what I mean by colonialism. And I've spent a lot of time, because I have to explain this to students and all kinds of community groups, and the best kind of answer I've come up with, or description, and the one that really captures, also really truly captures how Indigenous people understand colonialism, is that colonialism refers to the illegal theft and occupation of Indigenous lands by non-Indigenous peoples that is achieved through the social, political, and economic domination of Indigenous peoples. Colonialism is systematic, and it's built in and actualized through social structures that underpin our society. It's also a process that requires continuous replication to sustain itself. Canada is a colonial nation state. While certainly historical in nature, this is also absolutely an ongoing process. Canada continues to occupy Indigenous land and dominate Indigenous peoples. Canadian colonialism is ideologically grounded in racism and white supremacist beliefs that frame all aspects of indigeneity as inherently inferior to whiteness. This racist framing of inferiority depends on the dehumanization of Indigenous peoples and establishing Indigenous peoples as inherently deviant and dysfunctional, and ultimately a supreme threat to the colonial order of things. Because of course, the threat isn't about deviance and dysfunction, but instead it's about how our very existence undermines the legitimacy of colonial domination and this illegal occupation of our lands. Now, the important thing to know about colonialism as a dominant social system of oppression is that it works in interlocking ways with other systems of oppression. So in addition to racism, colonialism is achieved through heteropatriarchy, through economic marginalization and capitalist exploitation, ableism, and other forms of social hierarchy, which all work together to secure global hierarchies and systems of power, privilege, oppression, and violence. Just have to take a drink. Now, for this reason, the racist ideologies about Indigenous peoples that underpin Canadian colonialism are also explicitly gendered. So within colonial racist discourses, for example, Indigenous men are portrayed as inherently savage, violent men who threaten the existence of colonial Canadian society. You'll recognize this from historical images that portray Indigenous men as muscled warriors attacking and scalping white people. You'll also recognize this, though, from contemporary portrayals of our men. The very fact, for example, that the murder of 22-year-old Colton Bushy, a Cree man, could be justified on the grounds of trespassing is an example of this. Importantly, this framing not only legitimizes colonial control over Indigenous men, but it also establishes heteropatriarchal control over all women who need to be protected by particularly white men in this story from the violence of Indigenous men. Now, at the same time, colonialism devalues Indigenous women and girls. Now, within colonial racism, Indigenous femininity is confined to its own racist version of the heteropatriarchal Madonna-whore dichotomy. We are either Indian princesses or we are squaws. Indian princesses, perhaps best exemplified by Disney's Disney's bastardized version of Pocahontas, as are respectable, virginal, Indigenous women and girls who are willing to sacrifice their own Indigenous communities in support of colonial domination. And I say bastardization of Pocahontas because unlike the love story that Disney tells, the true story is one of a teenage girl who was kidnapped, sexually exploited, and died in captivity in Europe, which is actually a more accurate version of how colonialism sees and treats most Indigenous women and girls. Because the Indian princess binary sister is the squaw, a hypersexualized Indigenous female whose inherent deviance and dysfunction threatens colonialism. You see this all the time in those costumes they sell at Halloween, where it's, women dressed in scantily clad hide, maybe with a headdress, but the whole message is pure sex. Now, the irony of that whole colonial framing of the princess and the squaw is that regardless of which you end up, whether you're a princess or whether you're a squaw, Indigenous women and girls are always imagined as being inherently sexually available and thus violable. Truth be told, I don't know. This is going to get me a little emotional, so I apologize. I don't know an Indigenous woman who hasn't confronted or found herself confined to the role of the squaw, myself included. When I teach this to my students, I commonly share 3 squaw narratives that I've encountered over my lifetime. The first comes from my brother, also an Indigenous man. When he gets angry at me, when he's gotten angry with me, he has often thrown at me, "You can go and get as educated as you want, but you will only ever be a squaw." This is a way of attempting to undermine and devalue me as a person, but specifically as Nahia Esquo, as a Cree woman. Second example is the number of times that when I was dating, non-Indigenous men responded to learning that I was Indigenous with the comment, "So that means we are going to have a good time tonight," implying that I was ready and willing to have sex with them. The third example, and for me the most poignant, is when a white man attempted to drug and date rape me. When I figured out what was happening, I called the police. And as they came and arrested him in my apartment and were leading him out the door, I heard him say to those cops, "I never imagined I'd face so much trouble from a squaw." To which the white male cops agreed, and no charges were ever pressed. And these are on top of the weight I carry as a survivor of sex trafficking. For a decade, I swallowed my story, I swallowed my pain, and nearly self-harmed myself into destruction because I feared how the world would see and treat me as an Indigenous female survivor of sexual violence. Now, the consequence of this gendered, racist, ideological devaluation of Indigenous femininity, as my story suggests, is violence. As the original inhabitants of this land, our very existence as Indigenous women and girls represents a primordial threat to Canada as a colonial nation state. For this reason, our elimination, whether legally, whether through forced assimilation or through violence, is invaluable to colonial Canada's existence. Dominantly portrayed as deviant and dysfunctional, Indigenous women and girls exist in colonial Canadian society as dehumanized bodies, indeed objects, that are disposable and can be eliminated with relative impunity. I want to turn now to the connection of this violence to the land, environmental exploitation and degradation, and the extinction level climate change we are currently facing. I've always been struck by a quote that Ceci Waham, also known as Cree lawyer, scholar, and co-founder of I Don't Know More, Sylvia McAdam, highlights in her 2015 book, Nationhood Interrupted, Revitalizing Nahia Legal Systems. It comes from her dad, Francis McAdam, who says, "So long as men have no respect for the land, they will have no respect for women." I understand this quote as saying, how can we expect people who have no respect for the land as having respect for people? Because these two things are intimately connected for Indigenous peoples. The abuse of land is inherently related to the abuse of people, and thus violence against Indigenous women and girls, and indeed, actually, all women and girls. And it is the outcome of colonial societies who have also committed extraordinary violence against the land that has directly led us to this pivotal moment of extinction level climate change. Let me bring this discussion back to Canada just for a minute and really into this context. The colonial, racist, and gender dehumanization of Indigenous femininity as inherently available and violable was used to justify the colonial theft of Indigenous lands. And just like our women, this land was treated as something that needed to be tamed, exploited, and ultimately destroyed. And as a consequence, our women and girls, and indeed all Indigenous peoples, have paid the price. But by extension, given the current global climate crisis, so have all of you. Well, there are myriad examples of this violence. Let me offer a high-level overview. Throughout Canadian colonial history, Indigenous peoples have been forcibly removed from their land to facilitate resource extraction, building of railways, infrastructure, the creation of communities, you name it. A process I have written about, this forced removal, I've written about this in the UCLA Law Review as a form of human trafficking. Well, this has included things such as large-scale systematic processes of removal and containment, like the reservation system and also residential schools. It has also included forced relocations of entire communities, establishing non-consensual and fraudulent land use agreements and land claim, and in fact, treaty agreements are included here, and the authorization of police and military invasions of our communities. These displacements have always been accompanied by egregious acts of violence perpetrated against Indigenous women and girls, and indeed all Indigenous peoples. In other instances, Indigenous communities have been subjected to environmental racism, and have had to bear and have been forced to bear the burden of the toxic consequences of resource extraction and industry that genocidally impact our survival, whether in terms of our livelihood, in terms of reproduction, in terms of morbidity. There is also a growing body of research that demonstrates how violence against Indigenous women and girls increases with the arrival of resource extraction industries, such as the notorious man camps, these hyper-masculine temporary housing for folks who are working in the oil industry most often, but all industries, where violence against Indigenous women and girls is normalized. In fact, there's many studies underway that are showing that resource extraction, the arrival of resource extraction industries, is connected directly to the increase of sexual exploitation and trafficking of Indigenous women and girls. This is why we as Indigenous people fight so hard for the land. It's not just about reclaiming stolen land, but also honoring our relationship with the land and protecting it from colonial environmental violence, which in turn, of course, as I'm arguing, is linked to colonial gender-based violence. Indeed, it's our ethical responsibility as Cree people to take a stand. As Sylvia McAdam writes, silence and non-action do not exempt any human being from breaking laws. It's considered pastamoan, a verbal violation of natural law, to remain silent or to take no action while harm is being done to another human being or to anything in creation. Another fundamental component of Cree natural law is Natamawasawin. As McAdams explains, Natamawasawin is a law carried by Nahia people in times of great threat and crisis. It means to defend for all human children of the world, as well as all future generations. It also directs us to defend for the children of all animals, plants, water, and the winged ones, everything in creation that has spirit. Our fight for land is not just about us. It's about defending the lives of all things for future generations. We are fighting for all of our survival. This brings me back to my core argument. Ending violence against Indigenous women and girls, and indeed all forms of gender-based violence, can play a critical role in meaningfully mitigating the extinction-level consequences of global climate change. The social systems of oppression that underpin colonialism, racism, heteropatriarchy, capitalism are also the driving forces behind environmental exploitation and violence. We are in a position of extinction-level global climate change because a global elite has pursued power, privilege, and profit over the well-being of humanity through these social systems of oppression. In this way, ending colonial violence against Indigenous women and girls, and indeed ending all forms of gender-based violence and racist violence, is an environmental issue. Imagine this. To save the planet, we reject and we dismantle systems of domination like colonialism, racism, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism that are destroying our world and pushing us rapidly towards extinction. And instead, we embrace Indigenous ways of knowing and doing that honor and value all things in creation, and strive to live in harmony with the natural world and each other in ways that ensure all of our survival. What if we choose life and all life over violence and death? Indigenous ways of knowing and doing show us that is entirely possible. Now, given that I've named colonial violence against Indigenous women and girls today, and I've likely called out spirits who may be here listening, but also because some of you might be feeling the weight of this on your heart today, I also have an ethical responsibility to end things in a good way. And again, I'm going to do this through a song. Now, the song I'm going to sing is a traveling song, and it's meant to send spirits and people off in a good way. It's medicine as we come out of this really difficult and important talk. Now, I want to tell you again, there's going to be 4 rounds, but I won't be drumming in that final round, because what we do is we stop drumming and we just sing, and because sometimes the spirits want to come and sing with us as they leave us. And so I encourage you to listen for them, because sometimes they'll show up. So before I close with the song, I want to say Kinanas Kamatanao. That in Cree means thank you, but it means more than that. It means I'm grateful for all of you. I know this isn't an easy topic. I know this isn't something most people confront every day, and I'm grateful that you walk this journey with me this evening. So let me close with this song. I just need a water first. Way, hey, ya, hey, ya, hey, yo. 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 Way, Thank you all so much.
Robyn, I believe it's myself on behalf of everyone tuning in locally and across Canada and throughout the world that should be thanking you for that just incredibly powerful and moving talk. I can't thank you enough for your openness in starting out in a good way. I have to say, I am in awe that we have an acting provost who is a hand drummer and singer. I had no idea. I hope that you bring that to all of our events, because at the end, you're right, I could just feel the heaviness of the weight of the subject. And, you know, we're talking about such an important topic today. You could just feel it though kind of lift at the end there. So it's so critical, and the passion and power, I consider you one of these, you know, in our systems theory, you know, change agent, and we use the term, you know, a bridge builder, someone who is willing to kind of reach that hand out and take that first step to build a bridge. And I know Amanda and myself, the first time we met you, we were so taken, and it was that reason, your willingness to be open and have these tough conversations that we sure appreciated. So I see some questions are coming in. I'm going to communicate those to you, and we've got about 5 or 6 minutes for questions, and then I'll finish up with some opening remarks, if that's okay.
Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. So our first question from Kalena, she's one of our students in our Master of Sustainability program. She thanks you for sharing your story. It was moving and eye-opening, illuminating. As a non-Indigenous person, she wonders, what are some things that we can do to support Indigenous communities as we move towards dismantling colonialism?
That's a great question, and I think it's one of the most important ones, because you know, it's a question I get asked a lot, because people really do care. I said that on the radio this morning. You know, the radio announcer was trying to suggest that we're not that close together, you know, that there's a separation, but I don't think so, because I get this question all the time, because non-Indigenous folks really do get it more than we think sometimes. And this is a practical question. So some really practical things you can do. One thing is educate yourself. When I think back over my career, and especially with my activism around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, I would say like 75 to 80% of that time, so 20 plus years, was educating people about the scope of violence against Indigenous women and girls. And you know what, maybe that's my gift. My father-in-law likes to remind that I walk in two worlds, and that's my gift. But also, you know, think about what else I could be doing. Think about the things I could be doing in community, right? So educate yourself. There's so many incredible Indigenous books, movies, documentaries that talk about all these really great and important issues. And so I encourage you to seek those out. In fact, if you're a film buff, the NFB has a free Indigenous collection that offers some of the best storytelling around these issues. So I encourage you to check that out. The second thing I always suggest is support Indigenous peoples. You know, if we're having an event and we're taking a stand against, you know, whether it be climate change or walking for water or protesting missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, come and stand with us. I know that's a little more difficult now in the pandemic, but we need you. We need non-Indigenous folks to come and stand with us and say, you know what, this isn't right, and we demand better. I think that's really important. The other thing I think is important, it's back to education again. Talk to people, talk to each other, talk to your kids. You know, I always hit up against this challenge about, you know, how do you talk to kids about hard things like racism and colonialism? And I'm like, well, you know what, my kids who are 9, 7, and 3 have already encountered all of these things. You know, for example, having to watch, you know, their mom sitting on a couch watching, you know, a residential school and crying and wondering what was going on, and having to hear that story about my family's connection to residential schools. My kids were old enough to hear that, so other kids are, you know what, and you can do that in a really age appropriate way. And again, I want to say there are some great kids books that touch on some of these complicated issues, whether it be residential schools or missing and murdered Indigenous women, but there's also great books about the environment out there. So I encourage you to check those out. And I will throw this out there. If you're interested in knowing some of those titles, send me an email. I'll send you a list. So that's some really, you know, 3 really good practical things I think people can do.
Robyn, I love that. And, you know, you also must be a mind reader. That must be in addition to your gift of, you know, walking two different worlds. I think you must be a mind reader, because Savannah Stewart asked as one of our next questions, you know, she said, thanks for the incredible presentation. Are there any books or resources that you would suggest we read to educate ourselves more on the issue? And you beat her to it. And maybe, you know, to facilitate this, what I'd offer is, if, you know, you want to send us a few of your favorites at that intersection between, you know, environment and you know, Indigenous peoples and women and gender studies, we'd love to put them up with our presentation and make that a resource available. And
Absolutely.
We could, like, Robyn's top reads or something like that at these. I think that would be cool. Would you be up for that?
Absolutely, I'm in. I'm so in.
And Jenny, oh, you know what? You might want to charge for that, Robyn, because now Jenny is asking for the same thing, saying, you know, where can we get these direct us to these resources? So that's a deal. We're going to put together Robyn's top reading list and we'll circulate it. Another question here from Jessica Blythe, and she says, thanks so much for your eloquent and powerful talk. Respect for Indigenous knowledge must lead environmental efforts in Canada. Do you see a trend in this direction?
Yes and no. I will tell you that if you, for example, I really appreciate, there's some movements that have come under, you know, what's the one about the extinction one? What's it called? The group Extinction Rebellion. But I'm going to tell you, we appreciate the effort, but if you talk to some of our Indigenous leaders, they don't feel very happy about that movement, because they feel like Indigenous ways of knowing and doing aren't centered, but that also the kind of discourses and the actions are actually reinforcing colonialism. So there are still some issues, but then there are other versions of that group that have taken this up. And I see, you know, I think back, I just wish people would listen to David Suzuki. He's been saying this, you know, here's the pillar of environmentalism, and he's been saying, I mean, he wrote a book about the wisdom of the elders, you know, so I'm hoping that more and more that'll happen. And we have movements within our communities. I mean, we have an Indigenous environmental network that is doing incredible work. So I hope, and I really hope that, you know, people will see the brilliance and the ecological responsibility in our teachings, and understand that really that could be the pathway forward. We don't have to face the grim reality we are, because Indigenous peoples do have the knowledge to turn things around. And I really hope that maybe people will pick that up.
I hope so too. And of course, we're here celebrating this on Earth Day, and you know, the theme of Earth Day this year, right, is restore our Earth. And I'll just say a little bit about that at the end, but I definitely want to pick up on that. I've got notepads here with scribbles of important things that you said. So I know we're nearing time, but I want to ask you one more question from our audience. So this question comes from Allison. She again thanks you profusely for sharing your story with us. She says, I find many people view gender-based violence and climate change as two separate issues. So the first part of the question is, would you agree? And if so, do you have any tips on how to inform people on the interconnectedness between these two important issues?
Yeah, I absolutely, I agree. Actually, all forms of violence are seen this way. And that's kind of the problem with the systems of oppression, is that we disconnect these things. So it's really hard for people to see, for example, how colonial violence is linked to gender-based violence, which is linked to climate change and environmental degradation, and then to things like Black Lives Matters. These are all connected because those systems work in through one another, but they also give the impression that they're separate. And that's really, that's a problematic. And I think people see those things as separate quite often. Now, the way to resist that is just push back. I push back all the time, and really understanding that those systems work together. And sometimes I will say this, you got to remember, like, I used to be a really, like, if somebody said something wrong, I used to like jump on them, and I was like, oh, that's not our way. We're supposed to be kind. I heard that from elders more times than I can count. But I finally understood, that one of the things you need to do sometimes is be kind to people and walk them through it. So maybe that's why I'm a professor. But I will sit somebody down and say, no, you know what, here, and I'll give examples and show them, what, gender-based violence is connected to this. And I mean, not just for Indigenous women, we can see this all over the world, that women and girls, and I would add, all of our queer community, the 2S LGBTQIA people, everyone is targeted by gender-based violence through environmental racism and degradation around the world. We can see it everywhere. So it's just about sometimes sitting down with somebody and showing examples and taking the time. And, that's a gift of love, I think, in some ways, and kindness, and, that's the Cree way. Although sometimes, if somebody says something not very great, I might still be like, wait. But generally I'm kind. But it's a hard thing. And just keep reminding people, no, these are connected, these are connected, these are connected. You'll sound like a record, but eventually it'll get inside, and that their voice will be saying, these are connected, or I'm hopeful.
Robyn, thank you so much for that answer. I mean, these are the questions that I think, when I say I really feel you're that bridge builder and that relationship builder, taking those teaching moments in like through answering these questions and giving voice is so critical. So I know we're still have some questions coming in, and we're at time. So if you're open to it, Robyn, I know you encourage people to send you an email, and I'll encourage and thank our audience for asking such great questions. And if they have something they'd like to follow up with you on, maybe that would be okay.
Absolutely. I have
that's great. Thank you so much. And so let me just.
I was just going to say the best way to get a hold of me is through my VP Indigenous account. So it's just vpindigenous@brocku.ca. That will make sure that the message gets to me.
Perfect. And so I know we're experiencing a bit of a lag in the system, but I just want to end with a couple thank yous. First of all, I want to thank our wonderful students, Kian, Ryanne, Kahlan, Tory, Kiara, who joined us today. And I am so proud to be affiliated with Brock and to see the amazing things that are going on at our undergraduate level of education. It's just unbelievable to me that we'd be able to offer courses like that and provide those types of opportunities. Robyn, I'm humbled, feel privileged to have met you and to have you join us. I will tell the audience, we came to you for a recommendation. We never dreamed of even asking you and to offer, so thank you. It's just,
well, and you're stuck with me now, you know that, right?
I'm happy to be stuck with you, Robyn. It's just a wonderful and critical topic that we need to talk more about. We need to have those hard conversations, and we need to do it, with kindred spirits, that we can talk about these things in a good way, as you say, and make good progress. So the The third group of people I'd like to just say thank you to is my co-host Heather and Amanda, who's been behind the scenes the whole time, Amanda Smits, and the entire team with the Excellence in Environmental Stewardship Initiative that has been working to put the event today together. Last but certainly not least is all of you who are in the audience. We had a phenomenal turnout this evening to celebrate Earth Day. As I mentioned, it's a 51st anniversary of Earth Day, and the theme this year is Restore Our Earth. And I want to tie that into kind of Robyn's key message here about, you know, an unhealthy Earth isn't sustainable, and we need to change direction, and we need to find ways to do that. And part of that is in accessing and learning about different knowledge and different knowledge systems, different traditions, different ways of knowing, and having difficult conversations about, you know, really important issues and growing and learning from those. And, you know, for me, I actually not only had a lot of weight feeling about our talk tonight, but I actually took away from it a real message of hope, Robyn. And I don't know if that was intended, but for me, okay, for me, you know, I once you kind of got that weight past you, you know, you're like, wow, there's a really important hope of moving forward now, and I feel like we can continue to build those bridges. And so I hope that all of you in the audience also were able to take hope and inspiration from our talk this evening. I wish you the very best Earth Day. I hope that you're all staying safe. And I encourage you to please stay tuned to our website, as well as all of our social media channels, where we'll have information about forthcoming speaker series and events. And we'll say goodbye from St. Catharines for now.